My children didn't just forget Mother's Day. They booked a 5-star suite at the resort 5 miles from my front door and told me they were working overtime 3 states away just to avoid the burden of eating brunch with me. The silence in my kitchen at 7:15 a.m. was so thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. It was a hollow, mechanical silence, broken only by the rhythmic, lonely hum of the refrigerator, a sound that seemed to mock the stillness of the house. I sat at the small oak table, the one I had spent 6 months' worth of grueling night shift savings on 20 years ago, so that Brandon and Tiffany would have a proper place to do their homework. Now it was just a graveyard for a single cup of coffee that had long since gone stone cold. I didn't take a sip. I couldn't. My throat felt as though it had been lined with lead. Instead, I stared at the blue light of my smartphone, the glow illuminating the deep lines and sandpaper texture of my hands. These hands, small, gnarled, and perpetually dry, were the only witnesses to the 35 years of hardworking sacrifice I had poured into 2 people who currently viewed me as a ghost. I had logged onto Facebook with a tiny, pathetic spark of hope. I thought that maybe, just maybe, there would be a public post. A happy Mother's Day to the woman who raised us. A digital crumb for a starving soul. But the algorithm, in its unblinking and cruel efficiency, had pushed something else to the top of my feed. It was a digital knife, and it twisted the moment I saw the location tag. It was a photo of Tiffany. She was radiant, her skin bronzed and glowing, and wearing a designer bikini that likely cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. She was holding a frozen salt-rimmed margarita against a backdrop of turquoise water and white sand so bright it hurt my eyes. The location tag at the top of the post read, "The Azure Sands Resort and Spa." My heart did a slow, sickening roll. The Azure Sands. It was the crown jewel of our coastal town, a place of cold luxury that I had only ever seen from the outside while driving my beat-up sedan to the grocery store. It was exactly 5.2 miles from my driveway, a 10-minute drive. The caption beneath the photo was a masterclass in materialistic vanity. Living my best life. Hard work pays off. Nothing like a secret getaway to recharge the batteries. Hashtag solo vibes. Hashtag luxury. Living. Hashtag no distractions. Underneath it, Brandon had commented within minutes, "See you at the pool bar in 10, sis. This business trip is exactly what I needed. Cheers to us for making it happen." So this is how they repay me? The thought was a low, slow vibration in my marrow, a fragmented whisper that echoed through the empty rooms of a house that used to be full of their laughter. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they honestly believe that quiet wisdom meant I had lost the ability to navigate a social media feed? Or was it worse than that? Was I so invisible to them now that they didn't even bother to hide their betrayals? I am Martha Vance. I am 155 centimeters tall, and I weigh 53 kilograms. But in this moment, I felt as though I were disappearing entirely, evaporating like the steam that had long ago left my coffee. I looked around my kitchen. I had spent yesterday afternoon preparing. I had seasoned the pot roast. I had bought the expensive fingerling potatoes Brandon liked. I had even polished the silver spoons Tiffany used to insist on for her tea. I had done it all because they told me they were trying to find a way to make it home, despite their crushing schedules. Brandon had told me over the phone, his voice dripping with manufactured exhaustion, that he was stuck in Chicago, buried under a mountain of spreadsheets for a merger. Tiffany had claimed she was in Los Angeles, trapped in a chaotic fashion shoot that wouldn't end until Monday. They weren't in Chicago. They weren't in L.A. They were 5 miles away, sipping premium tequila and laughing about their business trip, while I sat in the dark with a cold pot roast and a sandpaper heart. I felt the choking sorrow rise up, a familiar guest that had been visiting more frequently since they moved out. But this time it was different. Beneath the hurt, there was a spark of something sharp, something clear-headed. They thought they knew me. They thought I was the self-sacrificing mother who would wait forever for a phone call that never came. They saw the quiet wisdom as a sign of sensory decline. They were so wrapped up in their delusions of power and their materialistic toys that they had forgotten who I was before I was mom. I reached out and touched the cold ceramic of my mug. My hand didn't shake. The low, slow voice in my head started to change. It was becoming firm. If they wanted a Mother's Day with no distractions, they were about to realize that the biggest distraction of all is a mother who has finally stopped being invisible. The digital knife had cut deep, but it had also cut the ties of my guilt. I looked at the photo of the turquoise water one last time. "Enjoy the pool bar, Brandon," I whispered to the empty kitchen, "because the bill for this business trip is about to come due." The turquoise water in Tiffany's photo was so bright. It felt like a physical weight against my eyes, a mockery of the gray, muted reality I had lived in for 3 decades. To understand the depth of that blue, the cold luxury of the Azure Sands Resort, you have to understand the gray slush of the winters I spent scrubbing floors. You have to understand the scent of industrial bleach that has lived in the pores of my sandpaper hands since 1996. I leaned back in the oak chair, my 155-centimeter frame feeling smaller than the 53 kilograms I carried. My bones felt like dry kindling, brittle and old. I closed my eyes, and the kitchen vanished. In its place was the ghost of Mother's Days past. Days that weren't filled with brunch and mimosas, but with the quiet, rhythmic throb of exhaustion. When David died 20 years ago, he left me with a $400 balance in our checking account, 2 children who still believed in the tooth fairy, and a mortgage that felt like a stone around my neck. I didn't have the luxury of a recharge. I didn't have a solo vibes weekend. I had a quiet wisdom that told me if I didn't bend until I nearly snapped, my children would be the ones to break. I remember the winters. The Connecticut slush would seep through my worn-out sneakers as I walked to my second job at the hospital. I was the night shift cleaner, the invisible woman who moved through the hallways with a mop and a bucket of chemicals while the world slept. My sandpaper hands aren't just dry from age. They are scarred from the caustic soap that ate away at my skin while I dreamt of a better life for Brandon and Tiffany. I remember the plasma center. It was a sterile, a fluorescent-lit purgatory on the edge of town. I would go there twice a month, sitting in a high-backed plastic chair, while a thick needle drained the life force from my arm. I'd watch my own blood swirl into the collection bag, feeling my head light and my stomach hollow, all for a 40 check. That 40 check wasn't for me. It was for the varsity soccer cleats Brandon had to have so he wouldn't be the poor kid on the team. It was for the silver flute Tiffany needed for the spring recital. I sold my blood so they wouldn't have to feel the sandpaper of poverty. I was self-sacrificing to a fault, a martyr who didn't even want the title. I remember the Mother's Days when they were teenagers. They'd bring me a burnt piece of toast and a hand-drawn card, and then I would cry with a quiet wisdom, telling them it was the most beautiful gift in the world. I didn't tell them I had spent the previous night scrubbing a surgical suite until my knuckles bled just so I could afford the eggs and bread on the table. I was hardworking because I had to be, but I was self-sacrificing because I loved them more than I loved my own dignity. I told them I wasn't hungry at dinner, living on the crusts of their sandwiches and the cold leftovers of their childhood. I took out a second mortgage, working double shifts until my vision blurred into a kaleidoscope of gray hospital tile, just to send them to the universities that gave them the delusions of power they now wield against me. And now they are at the azure sands. They are 5 miles away, using the salaries I funded with my plasma to buy margaritas and solo vibes. They are lying to me, pretending to be in Chicago and LA, because the sight of my sandpaper hands and my modest kitchen is a distraction from their materialistic perfection. They think they've moved beyond me. They think I am just a utility that has outlived its usefulness, a light bulb that has finally burned out. So this is how they repay me? The question felt like a leaden echo in the quiet kitchen. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they think that because I had shielded them from the struggle, I had somehow lost the ability to recognize betrayal? I had raised them to be materialistic by accident, I realized. By hiding the sandpaper of my life, I had taught them that luxury was a right and my labor was a given. I looked at the blue light of the phone again. Tiffany's smile in the photo was the same smile she had the day I bought her that flute, the one I paid for with my own blood. Brandon's comment about the pool bar was written with the same fingers I used to bandage when he fell on the soccer field. They are my greatest achievements and my most profound failures. The choking sorrow I felt wasn't just for the forgotten holiday. It was for the 20 years I spent being a ghost in my own life so they could be the stars of theirs. I had been a self-sacrificing fool, perhaps, but the quiet wisdom that comes with age was finally starting to whisper something else to me. If they wanted me to be a ghost, if they wanted to pretend I didn't exist while they enjoyed the cold luxury of the resort, and then I would show them exactly what a ghost is capable of. I stood up, my joints clicking like a rhythmic warning. The low, slow voice of my exhaustion was fading, replaced by a clear-headed sharpness. I wasn't just a mother. I was a woman who had survived 20 years of night shifts and plasma needles. They think they are the only ones who know how to recharge. They are about to find out that the silver nomad doesn't just travel, she conquers. The kitchen was still silent, but the sandpaper hands weren't shaking anymore. They were reaching for the second phone, the one with the 5.4 million followers. The ghost was about to put on her armor. The digital chime of my smartphone was a jarring, discordant sound against the heavy silence of the kitchen. It was 10 a.m. For a brief, flickering second, the mother in me, the one who had spent 30 years answering every cry and healing every scraped knee, felt a surge of hope. I looked at the screen. Brandon. I took a deep breath, smoothing my apron with my sandpaper hands. I felt the tightness of my Da Han Hop Tien Dao combination oily skin across my forehead, slick with the cold sweat of anticipation. I made my voice low, slow, and fragmented, playing the part of the fragile, aging woman they expected me to be. "Hello, Brandon?" "Hey, Mom, happy Mother's Day," his voice was booming, vibrating with a manufactured high-octane energy. But beneath the corporate bravado, I heard it, the faint, unmistakable rhythmic pulse of a steel drum band, and the distant, joyful splash of a pool. It wasn't the sound of a bustling Chicago office. It was the soundtrack of the Azure Sands Resort. "Thank you, honey," I whispered, my heart a leaden weight. Are you coming over? I have the pot roast ready. I bought the fingerling potatoes you like." There was a beat of silence, a practiced, clinical hesitation. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. Didn't Tiffany tell you I'm stuck in Chicago? This merger is a complete nightmare. I'm literally sitting in a boardroom right now surrounded by spreadsheets and cold coffee. I'll be lucky if I'm out of here by midnight. You know how it is at the firm. If you want that VP title, you have to sacrifice the holidays." So this is how they repay me, I thought, is staring at the seasoned roast sitting cold on the counter. He was 5 miles away, likely holding a premium lager, while he lectured me on sacrifice. "Chicago," I repeated, my voice trembling with a choking sorrow that I didn't have to fake. "It must be very cold there today." "Freezing," he lied, his voice thick with delusions of power. "The wind chill is brutal. Look, I'll send you a gift card for that steakhouse you like, okay? I've got to jump back into this meeting. Love you, Mom." Click. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Tiffany. "Hey, Mom, happy Mother's Day. Can't talk long. I'm in L.A. on a fashion shoot," she snapped, her voice brittle and impatient. She didn't even wait for me to speak. She was the embodiment of materialistic urgency. "It's total chaos here, and the lighting is a disaster and the models are being difficult. I hope you're having a nice, quiet day at the house. Did the flower arrangement arrive?" "No flowers yet, Tiffany," I said. My Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, felt pale and bloodless in the morning light. "Ugh, these delivery services are absolute trash," she hissed. "I paid for the premium Sunday delivery. I'll call them and demand a refund. Anyway, I have to go. The photographer is waving me over. Talk soon." I hung up and looked at the phone. The lies were so polished, so effortless. They were disrespectful toward elders, not because they were loud, but because they assumed I was too small and too dim to see through the glass. To them, I was a 155-centimeter, 53-kilogram obstacle to their solo vibes. They thought my quiet wisdom was actually a slow descent into senility. And did they really think I had become that senile? Did they think I wouldn't hear the ocean in the background of their boardrooms? Did they think I wouldn't see the tan lines in their fashion shoots? They were wearing the mask of the busy professional to hide the heartless reality of their greed. They wanted the cold luxury of the resort without the burden of the mother who had sold her blood to give them the very lives they were now using to exclude her. I felt a gradual escalation of power simmering in my marrow. The low, slow voice of the grieving mother was beginning to sharpen. The choking sorrow was being replaced by a clear-headed, strategic intelligence. I looked at my sandpaper hands, the hands that had scrubbed the floors and changed the diapers and signed the checks. Or I wasn't going to spend the day crying over a cold pot roast. "You want no distractions, Brandon," I whispered to the empty room. "You want solo vibes, Tiffany. I think it's time I showed you what a professional really looks like." I walked toward my bedroom, my pace quickening, my voice losing its fragmentation. I wasn't going to be the ghost of Mother's Days past. I was going to be the storm of their Mother's Day present. The secret life of Martha Vance was about to become very, very public. We spend our lives teaching our children how to speak, hoping that one day they will use those words to tell us they love us. But sometimes we only succeed in teaching them how to lie. We shield them from our struggles so they can grow up strong. But in doing so, we often raise adults who are incapable of recognizing the weight of someone else's sacrifice. Brandon and Tiffany didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a utility that had outlived its function. But the thing about utilities is that when you stop paying the bill of respect, the power gets cut off. And tonight, the lights are going out on their little resort fantasy. The silence that followed Tiffany's hang-up was different from the silence that had greeted me at dawn. At 7 a.m., the quiet was heavy, a suffocating shroud of choking sorrow. But now, at 10:15 a.m., the air in my kitchen felt charged, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of a storm front moving in. I looked at the cold pot roast on the counter, a monument to a mother who no longer existed, and I felt a strange, icy clear-headedness take hold. So this is how they repay me, I thought, my gaze drifting to my sandpaper hands. Did they really think I had become that senile? They saw a woman who struggled to remember her Netflix password. They saw a grandmother who they thought spent her days deadheading roses and waiting for the phone to ring. They had constructed a version of me that was safe, small, and technologically illiterate, a utility they could switch off when they wanted to enjoy the cold luxury of their solo vibes. But my children had made a fatal mistake. They had confused my quiet wisdom for a lack of strategic intelligence. I stood up, my joints no longer clicking with the sound of age, but with the precision of a soldier donning armor. I walked away from the oak table and the cold coffee. I went into my small, memory-filled study, the room where Brandon and Tiffany thought I spent my time, sorting through old scrapbooks. I went to my mahogany desk, reached into the bottom drawer, and pressed a hidden latch beneath the velvet lining. I pulled out a second phone. It wasn't a hand-me-down model with a cracked screen. It was the latest titanium frame flagship, a device of materialistic perfection that I had purchased with my own private earnings. I pressed my thumb to the sensor, and the screen bloomed into a vibrant, high-resolution life. I didn't log into the Facebook account where I followed local bake sales. I opened an app that my children used to perform their lives. I logged into an account the world knew as at the Silver Nomad. Tiffany spent her days pouting for her 12,000 followers, most of whom were bot accounts she'd likely bought to soothe her delusions of power. Brandon prided himself on his LinkedIn influence, bragging about his 5,000 connections. I looked at my dashboard. Followers, 5.4 million. Monthly reach, 22 million. 3 years ago, when the loneliness of this empty house became a physical ache, I didn't succumb to the loneliness of old age. I went to the airport. I started traveling to the places David and I had promised to see before the hospital bills and the tuition payments ate our dreams. I began taking photos, not of my face, but of the quiet wisdom I found in the world. I wrote about the sandpaper textures of ancient ruins, the cold luxury of hidden alpine lakes, and the self-sacrificing beauty of nature. I became a hidden weapon. I was the anonymous voice that the travel industry bowed to. I was the one who could make or break a resort with a single, unvarnished review. I had a private bank account filled with the dividends of my strategic intelligence, a fortune built while my children thought I was napping. I scrolled through my messages. My inbox was a sea of invitations from the world's most elite properties, begging for a silver nomad visit. And there, at the very top, was a message from 6 months ago. The Azure Sands Resort and Spa. They had offered me the diamond penthouse for a secret audit. I had ignored it then. I had wanted to spend Mother's Day in my kitchen with my family. I looked at my sandpaper hands again. Then I looked at the screen. My low, slow voice was gone. I whispered to the empty room, and my tone was firm, sharp, and decisive. You want a weekend with no distractions, Tiffany. You want to recharge without the burden of your mother, Brandon. Then let's see how you handle the light of the sun. I didn't call them back. I didn't send a guilt-tripping text. I opened my booking app. I didn't look for a mother's discount or a senior citizen special. I booked the diamond penthouse at the Azure Sands for an immediate check-in. I used my corporate credit card, the one issued to Nomad Media, LLC. I felt the gradual escalation of power blooming in my chest. For 30 years, I had been the soil they grew in. I had been the hard-working foundation that allowed them to reach for the sky. But every foundation eventually demands an audit. They thought I was home, crying over a pot roast. They didn't realize that the silver nomad was about to descend upon their little paradise. The greatest oversight of youth is the assumption that their parents' lives ended the moment they became mom or dad. They view us as static characters in their own grand narrative. It's forgetting that we are the ones who wrote the first 3 chapters. We shield our children from our complexity so they can feel secure, but in doing so, we often inadvertently teach them to see us as two-dimensional. Brandon and Tiffany didn't realize that my quiet wisdom wasn't a sign of slowing down. It was the accumulation of energy. A storm doesn't announce its arrival with a shout. It begins with a drop in pressure. They thought they had left me behind in the loneliness of old age, but they were about to realize that the person they ignored at the kitchen table was the most powerful person in the room. Never mistake a mother's patience for a lack of options. The kitchen was still cold, but my blood was beginning to burn. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, looking at the floral print duvet and the sensible orthopedic slippers tucked neatly under the bed. The costume of a woman Brandon and Tiffany had decided was finished. I looked at my sandpaper hands, the knuckles swollen, and the skin etched with the history of every floor I'd scrubbed to pay for their materialistic dreams. So this is how they repay me? The question didn't come with a sob this time. It came with a sharp, icy clarity. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that my quiet wisdom was just a slow fading light in an empty house? They thought they were the only ones who knew how to recharge. They thought their business trips were a wall I couldn't climb. And they were so blinded by their own delusions of power that they failed to realize that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has spent 30 years learning how to be invisible. I walked toward the back of my closet, pushing aside the cardigans and the grandma blouses I wore to put them at ease. Behind a false panel I'd installed myself 3 years ago sat my armor. I pulled out the garment bag. Inside was a silk, cream-colored pantsuit I had commissioned in Milan during a layover my children thought was a napping weekend. I laid it on the bed, the fabric shimmering with a cold luxury that Brandon's firm would envy and Tiffany's fashion shoots couldn't touch. And I reached for my jewelry box, not the costume pearls they had pooled their money to buy me for my 60th, the trash envelope of gifts, but a vintage Cartier watch I'd earned with a single sponsored post for a boutique hotel in the Maldives. My voice, once low and fragmented, was now clear-headed and sharp as I spoke to my second phone, the one with the titanium frame and the 5.4 million followers. Siri, book the Diamond Penthouse at the Azure Sands Resort. Check-in, immediate. Billing, Nomad Media, LLC. The chime of confirmation was the most satisfying sound I had heard in decades. I looked at the screen. The Diamond Penthouse. It was the only room in the resort that sat directly above the pool bar, with a 360-degree balcony that looked down on the entire property like a judge's bench. It cost $4,500 a night, and it was the hidden asset of my lifestyle, a perk of being the silver nomad. Tiffany thought she was living her best life in a standard suite. Brandon thought he was cheersing to success at a communal bar. They were playing in the sand while I was about to own the beach. I began to pack. I didn't take old scrapbooks or mementos. I packed my strategic intelligence. I packed a professional-grade ring light, a tripod, and a pair of oversized designer sunglasses that cost more than Brandon's monthly car payment. Every item I placed in my leather weekend bag was a brick in the wall I was building around their lies. I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror. I didn't see a hard-working widow. I saw a woman who had sold her plasma to give her children wings, only to find they were using them to fly away from her. I saw a woman who had been self-sacrificing for so long that she had forgotten her own name until the internet gave her a new one. I reached for my perfume, a scent of oud and sea salt that lingered like a memory. I sprayed it on my wrists over the scars from the night shifts and the hospital needles. "Chicago is freezing, is it, Brandon?" I whispered to the empty room. "L.A. is chaos, Tiffany. Then let's see how you handle a storm in your own backyard." I walked out of my house, the loneliness of old age falling away like a shed skin. I didn't look back at the cold pot roast or the single cup of coffee. I called a private car service, a black SUV, not a taxi. As I stepped into the leather interior, I felt the gradual escalation of power humming in my marrow. My children thought they were no distractions professionals, and they thought they had left the burden of their mother behind in a silent kitchen. They had no idea that the silver nomad was about to descend upon their little paradise with the force of 1,000 Mother's Days. My kindness was never a doormat, but they were about to find out exactly what happens when you try to walk all over the woman who owns the ground beneath your feet. We often spend our lives building fortresses for our children, believing that the stronger we make them, the more they will cherish the architect. But the truth is, when a child is raised in cold luxury without seeing the sandpaper hands that built it, they mistake the fortress for their own creation. They begin to see the architect as a relic, an outsider to the very world she made. Dignity is not something that is given. It is something that must be reclaimed when the ungrateful try to steal it. I shielded them from my struggle for 30 years, and in return, they shielded themselves from my existence. But a mother's quiet wisdom is a patient thing. It waits for the right moment to strike. Tonight, I am not just a mother. I am the auditor of their souls, and the bill is overdue. The spatial contrast was so violent, it felt like a physical blow to my equilibrium. One moment, I was standing in a kitchen that smelled of stagnant coffee and 20 years of unacknowledged labor. The next, the doors of the black SUV were being opened by a young man in a crisp white uniform, and I was inhaling the cold luxury of the Azure Sands Resort. The air here didn't smell like bleach or pot roast. It smelled of sea salt, expensive hibiscus, and the silent, heavy scent of old money. The lobby was a cathedral of polished white marble that stretched toward a ceiling draped in hand-blown glass chandeliers. Every surface was a mirror, reflecting a world where the sandpaper grit of reality was buffed away by a high-octane staff. I stepped onto that marble, and for a second, my joints gave a familiar, rhythmic click. And I looked down at my sandpaper hands, now partially obscured by the elegant cream-colored silk of my Milanese pantsuit. I felt the weight of the Cartier watch on my wrist, the tangible asset that represented a life my children chose to ignore. The invisible wall. I approached the reception desk. It was a massive slab of dark granite, manned by a young man whose smile was as synthetic as the polyester I used to wear to my night shifts. He looked at me, and I saw the familiar disrespectful calculation happen behind his eyes. He saw the gray hair. He saw the age. He saw a woman he assumed was lost, or looking for the early bird buffet. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. His voice was saturated with that patronizing empathy that people use when they think they're speaking to someone whose mind is slowly unraveling. Are you looking for the shuttle back to the senior center? Or perhaps the public restrooms?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, a quiet wisdom that forced him to actually look at me. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my black titanium card, the one linked to Nomad Media, LLC. I slid it across the granite along with my passport. "I have a reservation," I said. My voice was no longer low or fragmented. It was firm, sharp, and decisive. "Under Martha Vance, the Diamond Penthouse." The silence that followed was delicious. I watched the blood drain from his face as he swiped the card. His screen must have flashed the elite status, the silver nomad internal notes that the resort's corporate office kept on high-profile influencers. "Mrs. Vance," he stammered, his posture instantly collapsing from delusions of power into total, frantic subservience. I am so sorry. We weren't expecting. That is, the Diamond Penthouse is ready. We have your preferred vintage of champagne chilling, and the private elevator is keyed to your thumbprint. I'll have the manager personally." "That won't be necessary," I interrupted, my voice like a cold blade. "Just the key, And I'd like a direct line to the pool bar manager. I may be doing a site audit this afternoon. The living lie. As I turned toward the elevators, I saw them. The lobby lounge was an open concept space filled with plush velvet chairs and low-slung tables. And there, sitting by a cascading indoor waterfall, were the busy professionals. Brandon was leaning back, a premium lager in his hand, laughing as he showed something on his phone to a group of strangers. He looked relaxed, tan, and utterly unburdened by the Chicago merger he claimed was consuming his life. Tiffany was sitting across from him, her L.A. fashion shoot apparently consisting of taking 100 selfies while wearing a white bikini and a sheer cover-up. She was pouting at her screen, her thumbs flying across the glass, as she likely crafted another lie for her followers about how exhausted she was from her career. They were exactly 5.2 miles from my front door. They were clinking glasses, celebrating a Mother's Day that was no distractions, because they had successfully erased the mother. So this is how they repay me? I felt the choking sorrow flare up for one final agonizing heartbeat, but I choked it down. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they think I was so small that I wouldn't notice the world they were building on top of my sacrifices? They were so busy being materialistic, so consumed by their own delusions of power, that they didn't even notice the woman in the cream silk pantsuit walking right past them. I was 10 feet away, and to them, I was still just a ghost in a kitchen. I didn't stop. I didn't shout. I didn't reveal the secret life of Martha Vance just yet. I stepped into the private elevator, the doors hissing shut with a sound of absolute finality. I looked at my reflection in the gold-leafed mirror of the elevator. My Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, was no longer pale with grief. It was glowing with strategic intelligence. I adjusted my oversized sunglasses. "Enjoy your drinks." "But children," I whispered, as the elevator began its ascent to the diamond penthouse, "because the silver nomad is about to check in, and your business trip is about to become a very public disaster. The mirror of the elite. We often spend our lives trying to be seen by the people we love, only to realize that their vision is blocked by the very things we gave them. I shielded Brandon and Tiffany from the sandpaper of life so thoroughly that they lost the ability to see the texture of a human soul. They see the resort. They see the beer. They see the pouts. They don't see the woman who sold her blood so they could afford to lie to her. Dignity is a strange thing. It is often most powerful when it is invisible. But when the ungrateful mistake that invisibility for weakness, dignity must put on its armor. I am not checking into this resort to be a mother. I am checking in to be the auditor. One day, they will learn that the quiet wisdom of the elders is not a sign of silence, but a sign of a storm that has learned how to wait for the right moment to break. And when it breaks, it clears the air for everyone. The loneliness of old age is a myth we tell the young, so they can feel safe in their neglect. Tonight they will find out that I am never less alone than when I am reclaiming my own power. The private elevator ascended with a silent, pressurized hiss that made my ears pop, a physical reminder of how quickly I was leaving the loneliness of old age behind. When the gold-leaf doors slid open, I was greeted not by a room, but by an expanse of cold luxury so vast it felt like stepping into a dream. The diamond penthouse was a masterpiece of glass and air. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire perimeter, offering a 360-degree view of the Atlantic coastline. A private infinity pool occupied the center of the terrace, its water so still it looked like a sheet of sapphire. To anyone else, this was a $4,500 a night indulgence. To me, it was a tactical vantage point. I walked to the edge of the terrace, my heels clicking sharply against the white travertine. I reached out and gripped the polished steel railing with my sandpaper hands. The metal was cold, unyielding, much like the resolve hardening in my chest. Below me, the resort sprawled like an elaborate dollhouse for the ungrateful. From this height, the people were nothing more than colorful specks, but I knew exactly where to look. I pulled my professional-grade binoculars from my leather bag, the ones I had used to document the sunrise over the Serengeti for my followers. I adjusted the focus, my fingers steady despite the rhythmic throb of my heart. So this is how they repay me? The lens found the pool bar. There he was. Brandon, my busy professional. The man who was supposedly shivering in a Chicago boardroom, buried under a mountain of spreadsheets to save his career. I could see the condensation on the premium lager in his hand. He was leaning back in a cabana, his head tossed back in a loud, boisterous laugh as he clinked glasses with a group of strangers. He looked tan, healthy, and entirely unburdened by the Chicago wind chill he had described with such materialistic flair on the phone. I shifted the binoculars to the edge of the infinity pool. Tiffany, my L.A. fashionista. The chaos of her fashion shoot apparently consisted of her posing in a white bikini that cost more than my first car. She was holding a frozen margarita in one hand and her phone in the other, pouting at the lens, meticulously crafting the lie that she was 3,000 miles away. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that my quiet wisdom was a blindfold? And they were exactly 5 miles from my kitchen table. They were breathing the same sea air, watching the same sun, and yet they had constructed an entire continent of lies just to avoid the burden of my company. I felt a surge of choking sorrow, the final gasp of the mother who wanted to believe her children were simply overwhelmed. It was a low, slow ache that started in my marrow and worked its way to my throat. I looked at my sandpaper hands, the hands that had held them through fevers, the hands that had signed the tuition checks, the hands that had sold blood to ensure they never felt the grit of the world. I let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of a cord snapping. The loneliness of old age was a mask I had worn to protect them from the truth of my power. But as I watched them toast to their solo vibes below, I realized that my protection had only bred their arrogance. They didn't see the hardworking woman who built their foundation. They saw a relic to be managed. "Chicago is freezing, is it, Brandon?" I whispered into the wind. "L.A. is chaos, Tiffany. Then let's see how you handle the light of the sun." The sorrow vanished, replaced by a clear-headed sharpness. I turned away from the railing and walked back into the penthouse. My pace was no longer fragmented. It was firm, sharp, and decisive. I reached for my tripod. I set it up on the edge of the balcony, perfectly framing the pool bar in the background. I mounted my ring light, the white glow reflecting in my oversized designer sunglasses. I checked my second phone, the one with the titanium frame. Followers, 5.4 million. I wasn't just Martha Vance anymore. I was the silver nomad. And I was about to conduct the most public audit in the history of the Azure Sands Resort. "It's 4 p.m., I said to the empty suite, my voice vibrating with a gradual escalation of power. "Prime engagement time. Let's show the world what overtime really looks like in the Vance family." I reached for the live button. My finger didn't tremble. My quiet wisdom had finally found its voice, and it was going to be heard across every continent my children claimed to be in. The vantage of the invisible. The greatest oversight of the young is the belief that their parents are static objects, fixed in the background of their lives like furniture. They assume that because we have been self-sacrificing for 30 years, we have lost the capacity for self-preservation. They mistake our silence for an absence of thought. But there is a terrifying power in being invisible. When the world stops looking at you, you gain the ability to see everything. I spent decades in the shadows of my children's ambitions, and from those shadows I learned the architecture of their souls. Dignity is not a title you are granted by your children. It is a fortress you build for yourself when they try to leave you in the ruins. Brandon and Tiffany thought they were recharging in the light. They didn't realize that the silver nomad was the one who controlled the sun. Tonight they will learn that the quiet wisdom of a mother is not a sign of weakness. It is the calm before the reckoning. My finger hovered over the glowing red button on the screen of my titanium phone. It was a small digital circle, yet it felt like the trigger of a long-range rifle. I looked at my sandpaper hands, the skin thin as parchment, the knuckles slightly swollen from decades of night shift labor. They were trembling, but not from fear. It was the vibration of a 30-year-old engine finally shifting from self-sacrificing idle to a high-velocity roar. So this is how they repay me? The question echoed in the vast, cold luxury of the diamond penthouse. Did they really think I had become that senile? That I was just a ghost haunting the corners of my own kitchen, unable to see through the transparent glass of their lies? They were down there at the pool bar 5 miles from my front door, drowning their burdens in premium spirits while I was supposed to be weeping over a cold pot roast. I pressed the button. Live. The transition was instantaneous. Within seconds, the viewer count ticked up like a frantic heartbeat. 10,000, 50,000, 150,000. My community, the millions who knew me as at the Silver Nomad, poured in from every corner of the globe. They didn't see the lonely mother in a cardigan. They saw the woman who had conquered the Amalfi Coast and the Serengeti. They saw the quiet wisdom of a life reclaimed. "Hello, my loves," I said. My voice was no longer low and fragmented. It was firm, sharp, and decisive, carrying a resonance that had been honed in the silent halls of hospitals and the noisy terminals of international airports. Happy Mother's Day to all of you, 'tis especially the ones who find themselves unexpectedly alone today. The comments flooded the bottom of the screen. "Silver Nomad, we love you. Why the penthouse today? Where are you?" "I am at the Azure Sands Resort," I said, leaning against the railing so the pool bar was framed perfectly behind my shoulder, like a stage set for a tragedy. It is a beautiful place, cold luxury at its finest. I'm here because, well, I was told 2 very interesting stories today. I adjusted the camera angle using the optical zoom to bring the pool bar into sharp, undeniable focus. You see that young man down there? I pointed a sandpaper finger toward a cabana where a man in blue trunks was currently doing a shot with a group of cheering strangers. The one laughing so loudly, that's my son, Brandon. He told me this morning he was in Chicago, shivering in a boardroom, working a merger to save his career. He said he was sacrificing Mother's Day for the firm. I paused, letting the irony settle over the 300,000 people now watching. And that young lady by the edge of the infinity pool? I panned the camera slightly to the right, catching Tiffany in the middle of a hair flip for her own camera. The one in the white bikini? That's my daughter, Tiffany. She's supposedly in L.A. today, trapped in the chaos of a high-fashion shoot. She said the lighting was a disaster, and she couldn't possibly make it home for brunch. The comments section became a digital wildfire. Shame on them. Chicago looks very tropical, Brandon. The silver nomad is literally auditing their souls. I've spent 30 years being hardworking and self-sacrificing, I told the lens, my eyes clear-headed and sharp behind my designer sunglasses. I sold my blood to buy the cleats my son used to win his championships. I worked double shifts in chemical-scented hallways to pay for the degree my daughter uses to post her pouts. And today, they told me they were too busy to see me because I was a distraction from their success. I zoomed in further. I could see the brand of the watch Brandon was wearing, a watch I had helped him pick out for his graduation. I could see the logo on Tiffany's designer bag. Every bit of their materialistic perfection was a brick I had carried on my own back. I wanted to speak to you all about the loneliness of old age, I continued, the gradual escalation of power in my voice reaching its peak. People think the loneliness comes from a lack of people. It doesn't. And it comes from being made to feel invisible by the very people you gave your life to. But here is the strategic intelligence of the elderly. We are only invisible if we choose to stay in the shadows. I looked at the monitor. I saw Brandon pull his phone out of his pocket. I saw the confused expression on his face as he likely saw a notification, or perhaps a message from a friend watching the stream. I saw him freeze. I saw his face drain of color until he was the same shade as the sand. It looks like overtime is ending early for the Vance family, I said to the camera, a cold, elegant smile touching my lips. I'm going to stay live for a while. I want the world to see what happens when the foundation of a glass house finally decides to stand up. I was no longer the utility. I was the auditor, and the lens of truth was wide open. Or the lens of reality. We live in an age where image is everything, and reality is something to be edited, filtered, and cropped until the struggle is invisible. My children grew up in the world I built, a world where they never had to see the sandpaper, grit of my night shifts, because they never saw the cost. They never valued the product. They thought they could edit me out of their Mother's Day. They thought I was a distraction from their solo vibes. But the quiet wisdom of a mother is like a mirror. If you don't like what you see in it, it's not the mirror's fault. It's the truth of the reflection. Dignity is not a request. It is a reclamation. By turning the lens on their lies, I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. Or I was teaching them the one thing they never learned in their expensive universities. You cannot build a penthouse on a foundation you refuse to acknowledge. Today, the silver nomad didn't just travel to a resort. She traveled back to her own soul. And the view from here, it's absolutely spectacular. The live button pulsed on the screen like a digital heartbeat, a glowing red beacon of the reckoning I had finally summoned. I sat in a plush, velvet-lined armchair on the balcony of the diamond penthouse, the cold luxury of the resort wrapping around me like a silken shroud. Below, the Atlantic Ocean churned with a restless energy, but it was nothing compared to the storm currently erupting on my phone. Within minutes, the viewer count had surged past 500,000. My community, the millions of souls who followed at the Silver Nomad, wasn't just watching, they were mobilizing. The comments section was a blur of righteous fury, moving so fast it looked like white water. Look at his drink. He's toasting to a lie. 5 miles away, my heart breaks for her. Is that Tiffany Vance? I follow her for fashion tips. She unfollowing now. I watch the screen with a clear-headed, sharp intensity. My sandpaper hands, which had spent the morning trembling over a cold pot roast, were now steady as stone. I felt a gradual escalation of power vibrating in my marrow. For 30 years, I had been the silent foundation, the self-sacrificing soil that allowed my children to bloom into these materialistic monsters. I had protected them from the grit of my life so thoroughly that they believed I was incapable of feeling the sting of their neglect. So this is how they repay me, I thought, the question no longer a whisper of hurt, but a roar of clarity. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that because I had gray hair and a quiet kitchen, I had lost the strategic intelligence to see through their delusions of power? I leaned forward, the ring light reflecting in my designer sunglasses, making me look like a high priestess of truth. I want you all to look closely, I told the camera, my voice firm and decisive. I used the optical zoom to focus on Brandon. He was currently showing his phone to a group of men at the bar, likely bragging about a deal he hadn't even closed. My son is currently on a business trip to Chicago. It looks remarkably like the Azure Sands pool bar, doesn't it? Perhaps the Windy City has undergone a tropical transformation today. Then I panned the lens to Tiffany. She was adjusting the strap of her white bikini, pouting at her own camera, lost in her materialistic reflection. And my daughter, the fashion mogul in Los Angeles. She's so busy with her chaotic shoot that she couldn't spare 10 minutes to visit the woman who sold her blood so she could buy that camera. The digital firestorm reached a fever pitch. My followers were no longer just observers. They were investigators. They had found Brandon's LinkedIn. They had found Tiffany's latest LA post and were flooding it with the truth. You see, I continued, my voice carrying the quiet wisdom of a lifetime of observation. We live in a world that prizes the aesthetic over the authentic. My children think that as long as the photo looks perfect, the lie doesn't matter. They think that disrespect toward elders is a victimless crime if the elder is tucked away in a quiet house. But tonight, the lights are coming on. I watched the pool bar through my binoculars while the phone remained mounted to the tripod. I saw the exact moment the firestorm hit the ground. Brandon's phone chimed. Then it chimed again and again. I watched him pull it from his pocket, his face still flushed with the arrogance of the premium lager. I watched his expression shift. Confusion, denial, and then a pale, sickening mask of terror. He began scrolling frantically. He looked around the pool area, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He tapped Tiffany on the shoulder. She swiped her screen, her pout dissolving into a look of pure horror. They both looked up. They scanned the towering heights of the resort, at their eyes landing on the diamond penthouse, the only balcony with a professional lighting setup, and a woman in a cream silk suit, standing like a monument against the dusk. Even from 30 stories up, I could feel their delusions of power shattering. They realized they weren't the ones in control of the narrative. They realized that the lonely mother they had abandoned was the very force that was currently dismantling their reputations in real time. "I may be old, but I am not foolish," I said to the camera, my gaze fixed on the two tiny figures below. "You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that the utility you discarded is the same woman who knows how to navigate the world you think you own." I didn't feel the choking sorrow anymore. I felt a terrifying, beautiful freedom. And the secret life of Martha Vance was no longer a secret. I was the landowner, the auditor, and the mother who had finally stopped being a doormat. "Stay tuned," I told my 5 million followers. "The overtime meeting is about to begin, and I think my children have some explaining to do." I ended the stream. The silence of the penthouse was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of the justice I was about to deliver. I straightened my silk lapels, checked my Cartier watch, and waited for the elevator to chime. The spatial contrast between my modest kitchen and this glass fortress was finally complete. I was no longer waiting for them. They were coming to me. The digital mirror. We live in a century that confuses visibility with value. My children believed that because they were the ones posting, and they were the ones who existed, they viewed my quiet wisdom as a void, a lack of content, failing to realize that the most powerful stories are the ones that don't need a filter. Dignity is a quiet thing until it is forced to speak. I shielded them from the sandpaper of my life because I wanted them to be soft. But softness without gratitude is just rot. Tonight I realized that the greatest gift I could give my children wasn't another sacrifice. It was the truth of their own character. They thought they could edit me out of their Mother's Day, but they forgot that I am the one who holds the original copy. Never mistake a mother's patience for a lack of a plan. The digital world is fast, but a mother's memory is eternal. The sound against the heavy mahogany door of the diamond penthouse wasn't a knock. It was a frantic, desperate pounding, the rhythmic, hollow thud of two reputations hitting rock bottom. It was the sound of the busy professionals finally clocking out of their lies and punching into a reality they never prepared for. I didn't answer immediately. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the $500 champagne, feeling the cold, crisp bubbles settle the last of the choking sorrow in my chest. I straightened the lapels of my cream silk pantsuit, checked my reflection in the gold-leafed mirror, and ensured the titanium phone was still securely mounted to the tripod, its lens aimed toward the foyer. The live stream was still active. 500,000 people were currently waiting for the sequel to the overtime meeting. I opened the door. Brandon and Tiffany stood in the hallway, panting, their faces a mottled, ugly red that clashed violently with the cold luxury of the resort's corridors. They were still in their swimwear, Brandon in his dripping trunks, Tiffany wrapped in a fluffy resort towel that seemed to be the only thing holding her materialistic vanity together. They looked small. They looked like the children who used to hide broken vases behind their backs. But this time, the vase was my heart, and they had shattered it in front of a global audience. "Mom," Brandon gasped, his voice a fragmented wreck of the corporate bravado he'd used this morning. "What are you doing? Why are you even here? People are calling my office. My boss just messaged me on LinkedIn asking why I'm at a pool bar in Florida when I took bereavement leave for a funeral." I leaned against the doorframe, my sandpaper hands resting lightly on the silk of my sleeves. My voice was no longer low or slow. It was firm, sharp, and decisive. "A funeral, Brandon? I thought you were in Chicago, buried under a mountain of spreadsheets for a merger. Was the merger the funeral, or was I the one being buried?" "Mom, stop it," Tiffany cried, her real tears finally smudging the expensive waterproof mascara she'd worn for her LA shoot. "You have to delete that video, now. My main sponsors are already emailing me about moral turpitude clauses. They're saying I'm heartless. You're ruining my career." I looked at her, my eyes clear-headed and sharp. "Your career, Tiffany? And the one I funded by selling my plasma twice a month for 3 years, so you could have the right portfolio? The career that was so chaotic in LA that you couldn't drive 5 miles to see the woman who gave you the blood in your veins?" "We were going to come by tonight," Brandon lied, his delusions of power flaring up one last time as he tried to push his way into the room. "We just needed a break, Mom. You're so demanding with your quiet wisdom and your expectations. We just wanted one weekend to feel like adults without the guilt of being hard-working children." I stepped back, not to let him in, but to let the light of the penthouse, the light I had earned, illuminate their shame. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The gradual escalation of power had reached its peak. "I may be old, but I am not foolish." "Brandon," I said, the signature dialogue cutting through his excuses like a hot wire through wax. "You've forgotten who built this empire. You thought that because I wore the same winter coat for 9 years to pay for your MBA, I had lost the capacity to recognize a fraud. You thought that because I sat quietly in that kitchen, I had become a piece of the scenery you could ignore until it was convenient for you." "Mom, please," Tiffany sobbed, reaching for my hand, the same sandpaper hand she had ignored in her social media posts. "We'll make it up to you. We'll stay for dinner. We'll pay for this room. Just tell your followers it was a prank. Tell them the silver nomad is just playing with her kids." I pulled my hand away, and the spatial contrast between my strength and their weakness was absolute. I looked at them, 2 adults who had traded their souls for solo vibes and materialistic pouts. "I don't need you to pay for the room, Tiffany. I own the room," I said, my voice vibrating with strategic intelligence. "And you're not playing with me. You're being audited. You told the world I was a distraction. You told the world I was invisible. But as it turns out, I'm the only one here with an audience that actually values the truth." I turned the phone toward them, the screen glowing with the comments of 500,000 people who were witnessing the clash. Brandon and Tiffany dove away from the lens, cowering behind a marble pedestal. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on," I said, the closing moral line, final and absolute. "It was the bridge that brought you to this life." And since you've decided to burn it while I'm still standing on it, you shouldn't be surprised when you find yourselves treading water. I pointed toward the elevators. Go back to your business trips. Go back to your fashion shoots. But do not come back to my kitchen, and do not call me Mom until you learn how to be a son and a daughter. I slammed the door. The lock clicked. A sharp metallic period at the end of a 30-year sentence. I walked back to the balcony, the silence of the penthouse no longer lonely, but full of the freedom I had finally reclaimed. The architecture of the clash. We spend our lives building towers for our children, hoping they will invite us to see the view. We mistake our self-sacrificing silence for a virtue, failing to realize that by hiding our strength, we invite their arrogance. Brandon and Tiffany didn't lose their jobs and their followers because I was cruel. They lost them because they were empty. They built their lives on the aesthetic of success while ignoring the sandpaper of reality. A parent's greatest duty isn't just to provide. It's to demand respect for the provision. Dignity is a fire. If you don't tend to it, the ungrateful will try to use it to warm themselves while they let you freeze. But tonight, the fire was mine, and the only thing burning was the bridge of lies they thought they could walk across. Never apologize for standing up. Even a silver nomad has to stop traveling long enough to remind the world who owns the ground. The silence inside the diamond penthouse after the door slammed was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of an empty kitchen. It was the ringing, crystalline silence of a courtroom after the verdict has been read. I stood with my back to the mahogany, my 155-centimeter frame feeling as tall as the glass tower itself. My sandpaper hands, the hands that had scrubbed, bled, and sold plasma, were finally still. The choking sorrow had been cauterized by the cold, sharp light of the truth. I walked to the balcony, the cream silk of my pantsuit whispering against my legs. On the travertine table, Brandon's phone, dropped in his frantic swimming trunk-clad retreat, was vibrating with a relentless, rhythmic fury. I didn't have to guess who was calling. The Silver Nomad live stream had reached 1.2 million concurrent viewers before I ended it, and the digital firestorm had jumped from social media to the real world with the speed of a lightning strike. I picked up the device. The caller ID read, Arthur Sterling, CEO. Arthur was a man I knew well, though he didn't know I was the Silver Nomad. He was a man who prided himself on hardworking integrity, the kind of man who had built his firm on the bones of old-school grit. He was also a man who had attended the same charity galas where I had sat in the back, invisible in my modest floral dresses. I answered. I didn't use the low, slow voice of the lonely mother. My tone was firm, sharp, and decisive. "Hello, Arthur," I said. There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Martha, is that you on the screen? I'm looking at a viral clip of my senior associate in a cabana at the Azure Sands, and he told me he was on bereavement leave because his mother had passed away unexpectedly." I looked out at the ocean, my Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, glowing in the twilight. "Did you really think I had become that senile, Arthur? Or perhaps my son simply found it more materialistic to kill me off for a weekend of premium lager than to spend an hour at my table?" "Martha, I am so sorry." Arthur's voice was cold, the sound of a professional door slamming shut. "We don't promote liars to vice president. Brandon's career at Sterling and Associates ended the moment you hit that live button. Tell him his personal effects will be couriered to his home. He is no longer welcome on our property." I hung up. I didn't feel joy, but I felt a profound sense of strategic intelligence fulfilled, and the delusions of power Brandon had carried like a shield had been his undoing. He had gambled his future on the assumption that I was a utility he could switch off. He had forgotten that a foundation doesn't just support, it holds the deed. Outside in the hallway, I could hear Tiffany's voice rising in a shrill, hysterical pitch. She was on her own phone, likely speaking to her manager. "What do you mean Glow Beauty is pulling the contract? It was just a misunderstanding. My mother is... She's just being dramatic. It's a prank." Her voice broke into a jagged sob. "They're calling me the heartless daughter on Twitter. I'm trending for all the wrong reasons. Please, you have to fix this." I walked to the door and opened it just an inch. The spatial contrast was absolute. I was standing in the cold luxury of a $4,500 penthouse. They were huddled in a public hallway, stripped of their pinstriped armor and their L.A. fashion pretenses. "It's over, Tiffany," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics like a scalpel. "The online community doesn't value materialistic pouts when they're built on disrespect toward elders. You wanted no distractions, and now you have them. You have no sponsors, no shoots, and no lies left to tell." Brandon looked at me, his face pale and sunken. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a too-late apology that tasted like copper. "Mom, why? Why would you do this to us? We're your children. You've destroyed everything we worked for." I stepped out into the hallway, my gaze clear-headed and sharp. I looked him directly in the eye, the same eyes I had wiped when he was a boy, and the same eyes that had looked at me this morning and seen an outsider. "I may be old, but I am not foolish, Brandon," I said, delivering the signature dialogue with the weight of 30 years of silence. "You've forgotten who built this empire. You thought you could treat my life like a draft you could edit to suit your aesthetic. You thought my self-sacrificing nature was a weakness you could exploit forever." I straightened my back, my 155-centimeter frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow them both. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on," I said, the closing moral line ringing through the corridor. "It was the bridge that carried you to this resort. And tonight I've decided to reclaim the land it was built on. Go home, if you can still afford the gas." I closed the door. The clash was over. The consequence was absolute. I walked back to the center of the room, picked up my champagne, and watched the stars emerge. I wasn't a lonely mother anymore. I was a woman who had finally signed her own name to her own life. The cost of the signature. We often spend our lives signing our names to things for our children. Permission slips, tuition checks, mortgages, hoping that each signature is a brick in their future. But we rarely realize that the most important signature we ever make is the one that asserts our own dignity. My children believed that because I was hardworking and self-sacrificing, I had lost the strategic intelligence to defend myself. They mistook my patience for permission. But the quiet wisdom of age is a patient auditor. It keeps a ledger of every disrespectful word and every materialistic betrayal, and not to be cruel, but to ensure that the signature moral line is never crossed. Brandon and Tiffany didn't lose their world because I was vengeful. They lost it because they built it on sand while mocking the rock. Today, I didn't just reclaim my Mother's Day. I reclaimed the hidden asset of my soul, the realization that I am not a character in their story. They are guests in mine, and the lease is officially up. The sun began its final descent over the Atlantic, bleeding shades of deep violet and bruised orange across the horizon, the exact colors of a heart that has finally stopped aching and started healing. I sat on the edge of the private infinity pool in the diamond penthouse, the warm salted water swirling around my ankles. I looked at my sandpaper hands, resting peacefully against the cream silk of my trousers. For the first time in 35 years, they weren't reaching for a cleaning rag or a grocery list. They were simply holding a glass of vintage champagne, catching the last of the light. The spatial contrast was finally complete. 12 hours ago, I was a ghost in a cold kitchen, staring at a seasoned pot roast that no one would ever eat. Now, I was the silver nomad, the architect of a digital reckoning that had shifted the very axis of my world. The silence here wasn't hollow, it was full. My titanium phone, resting on the travertine ledge, hummed with a final desperate vibration. A text from Brandon. "Mom, please answer. I'm at a motel. The bank froze my corporate card. I don't know how to fix this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Then a flurry of notifications from Tiffany's accounts, now flooded with comments from millions of people who had seen the truth. Her LA fashion persona had been liquidated by the clear-headed reality of her own disrespect toward elders. So this is how they repay me, I thought. But the question no longer carried the weight of a victim. It was the observation of an auditor. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that my quiet wisdom was a sign of a fading mind, rather than a gathering storm? They had mistaken my self-sacrificing nature for a permanent state of being, never realizing that the foundation of a house is the strongest part of the structure, and the part most capable of bringing the whole thing down if it's mistreated. I didn't reply to the text. I didn't need to. The too late apologies were just more materialistic attempts to regain the cold luxury they had lost. They weren't mourning the mother they had hurt. They were mourning the status they had surrendered. I looked at the Cartier watch on my wrist. It was 7:15 p.m., exactly 12 hours since I had discovered the digital knife in my kitchen. In those 12 hours, I had dismantled the delusions of power that my children had built on the back of my night shifts and plasma donations. I had used my hidden weapon, the At the Silver Nomad identity, not to be cruel, but to be honest. Dignity is a quiet thing until it is forced to scream, and today, mine had found its voice. I reached for my phone and opened the camera one last time. I didn't go live, I simply took a photo of the sunset, my own silhouette reflected in the glass of the penthouse. The loneliness of old age is a myth designed to keep us in the kitchen, I whispered to the rising stars. We are only lonely if we believe we are finished. I posted the photo with a simple caption. The audit is complete. The foundation is strong. Moving forward into a new horizon. Hashtag Silver Nomad. Hashtag The Final Lesson. Hashtag Quiet Wisdom. Within seconds, the world responded. not with pouts or lies, but with a roar of support from millions who understood that age is not a decline, but a refinement. I stood up, my joints no longer clicking with the fragmented sound of exhaustion, but with the steady rhythm of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own time. I walked back into the penthouse, leaving the door to the balcony open to the sea breeze. The scent of hibiscus and expensive salt air filled the room, washing away the phantom smell of industrial bleach that had haunted me for decades. I may be old, but I am not foolish, I thought, repeating the signature dialogue that had become my new mantra. I am the one who built the empire, and I am the only one who gets to decide who lives in it. My children were 5 miles away, trudging through the sand toward a future they would have to build with their own sandpaper hands if they had the courage to try. I had shielded them from the struggle for too long, and in doing so, I had nearly lost myself. But the hard-working widow was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew that her kindness was never a doormat, but a bridge, and that bridge was now closed for renovations. I sat down at the glass dining table, where a chef-prepared meal of seared scallops and microgreens awaited me. I took a bite, savoring the heat and the spice. "Happy Mother's Day to me," I said, my voice firm, sharp, and decisive. The ledger of life. We spend our lives teaching our children how to walk, hoping they will one day walk beside us. And we hide our sandpaper hands and our self-sacrificing nights because we want them to live in a world of cold luxury and light. But we forget that by hiding the cost, we teach them to ignore the value. The greatest life lesson I can offer as the silver nomad is this: do not become a ghost in your own story just to make the other characters feel powerful. My children thought my quiet wisdom was a lack of options. They forgot that the earth doesn't shout, but it always has the final word. When you find yourself being treated as a utility, remember that you are the one who controls the power. Reclaim your name, reclaim your grit, and never, ever let the ungrateful convince you that you are invisible. The sunset is not the end of the day. It is the beginning of the stars. And from where I am sitting, the view is absolutely perfect.